Hi students, this is my last video on the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to talk a little bit in this video about some of the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. And first we're going to talk about labor and factory labor. Labor is the other component of these factories. These new technologies are very efficient. It's not as though you need skilled labor, but you do need a large number of people. And fortunately for the factory owners at least, we know, and I've talked about this and emphasized this a number of times now, the population was growing as a result of the agricultural revolution, as a result of the production of more food at this time. And so there is a supply of labor, an oversupply of labor in fact, and the requirement is only for unskilled labor. And so that means that these laborers come from the countryside, where there are now no jobs for them because of the mechanization of agriculture, and they come to the factories. But because they're unskilled, employers don't have to pay them very much, and employers can hire and fire them as they please, and they're easily replaceable. And so you have a situation in which people come to work at the factories, and housing for the workers in the factories grows up around the factories. And so this housing is going to be cheap, and it's going to be unhealthy. It's kind of unnatural, right? If you think about Western Civ 1, or you think about civilization up until this point, Western civilization and society up until this point, you build a place to live, and then you start to work, and you build a place where you work. And this is part of the change that happens with the Industrial Revolution. Now you have people who are building factories, and people are building places of work around the factories. And this is a whole new situation that society is trying to adjust to. New relationship between the workplace and the home. And it's also the case that society is having to adjust to the fact that some of these working conditions are unhealthy, and you don't want those around the place where you live. But at this point, there are no zoning regulations, and so the places where these people live, what we might refer to as urban slums, are right on top of the factories and are affected by all the air pollution, all the water pollution, and all the bad sanitation that comes from building cheap housing. And so it's a very toxic situation. It's a toxic situation, and people are often sharing houses together, even rooms together. And so we have the emergence of the working class family. Couples who move to the factories, or who marry living around the factories, but are being paid so little they're never going to be able to afford property of their own, and are being paid so little that both of them have to go to work in order to support themselves, in order to pay the rent to live in these urban slums. And if they have children, once the children are about 4 years old, the children have to go to work as well. And again, previously, the labor laws were the laws of nature. You couldn't work when it got dark. You couldn't work when it wasn't the season for farming. Now, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, man is challenging nature. Remember, I talked about this as the ideological aspect of the Industrial Revolution in one of my earlier videos. Now it's the case that you have gas lighting, you can keep the lights on into the night, you can keep people working, you can set much longer days, so people are working 13-hour days, and there's no kind of recognition of the ways in which the seasons affect human beings' bodies. Instead, there's this mechanized, totally scientific approach to the world. And so you have children working days, working 12, 13-hour days, who are as young as 4. You have women who are pregnant, who are working these very long and demanding days. And this puts all sorts of stresses on what have been established, at least, as the life of the family. That now parents might not see each other very much, children might not see their parents very much. They live more of their lives with people who they have no connection to except as workers than they do with people who they are biologically related to. And this is a huge, huge change. And it also raises questions of the relationship between employees and employers. Sometimes it's the case that these employers are just being unscrupulous. Other times it's that they're dealing with a situation that they have no experience with before. And they treat human beings as machines because they have this scientific approach to society. And previously, the people you worked for, you were either related to or you had grown up with their families for probably a couple of generations, and you lived in these more tightly knit, smaller communities. Now you're in a situation where you're working with tons and tons of people who you didn't know a month ago, a week ago. And so at the same time as there are no legal imperatives for employers to take care of their workers, for other workers to take care of workers who are struggling, it's also the case that there's no emotional drive either, that people don't really know each other, that people are disconnected from one another in that way socially. Also in this part of this week's material on the Industrial Revolution, I talk about the transport network. So the part about labor, that's kind of the end of the part of the factory and the creation of the Industrial Revolution. Transport network is going to bring this revolution to more people. So we're going to see the creation of roads, the creation of canals, the creation of steamships and railways. All of these things are driven by the steam engine. The steam engine drives the trains, drives the boats, makes it possible to create the metal, to make the railroads, and to make the boats, makes it possible to put together the cement that will form the canals. And so we start to see the creation of transportation networks that will make people more and more connected. That means you can have a giant factory in one part of your kingdom or one part of your country that's producing all of a certain type of product for the whole country. And this is this economic dependence that I was talking about earlier. Industrial Revolution centralizes production, and it makes different parts of society more dependent on one another. And so the world is becoming more connected. Different countries are being connected through these transportation systems, but also becoming more dependent. Now let's talk a little bit about the other end of society. How does the Industrial Revolution affect wealthier people in society, who unquestionably benefits from this huge change in society? The Industrial Revolution is a time when you see the emergence of what we would call the middle class, the emergence of a new wealthy class who do not owe their position to their birth or to their place in society. And these people are typically businessmen and women, merchants, lawyers, and doctors. These people become much more wealthy as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And that's because there are more goods, like clothes. I keep talking about textiles, but it's helpful just to have one industry to talk about. If we just talk about textiles, there are more clothes to buy and they're cheaper. At the same time, there's still a high demand for the services of doctors, especially as conditions in these areas that can be around the factory can be so unhealthy. There's definitely a demand for lawyers as previous practices of employment and standards of work are being challenged. And so these people are becoming more wealthy as a result of the Industrial Revolution. We also see the development of middle class family structure as a result of these changes. And that's a structure in which these people are living in a town. The man will go out to work. The woman is supposed to be a homemaker and hostess. And in general, the children are more removed from, at least from their fathers, if not their fathers and their mothers than before. And so this is where we get the idea of the family where you have these the sort of Victorian family, where both parents are a little more remote and the children are kind of raised by a nanny. And what people more and more are arguing is that this is something new, that we're seeing a big change both for the wealthy in society, I'm talking about right now, and also in the working class. That prior to this point, the idea that the wife or the woman in the relationship is totally a homemaker, that's something that's new. That's new at this time. Up until this point, women were hugely important in economic terms, in terms of the production of food, in terms of the production of clothing, two hugely important industries. And it's difficult for us to recognize that because we have an industrial revolution mindset, where we think that if people aren't leaving the house to go to work, then they're not actually working. They're just kind of tied to the home. But now is a great time to emphasize that before the Industrial Revolution, the idea was that women were workers and were a part of the economy, but simply that they worked from home and they worked in these more family oriented type of units. And now that's changing. It's changing for working class families, where women are working in the factories, where they're subject to very difficult working conditions. And it's changing for wealthier women, where they're not working at all. And instead, their role is purely domestic or purely entertainment. So I think that's something really interesting, as an interesting perspective to keep in mind. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about reactions to the Industrial Revolution. The main reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the most important one, is Romanticism. It's called Romanticism. And this is a movement that emerges in the 19th century that rejects a lot of the changes that we've been tracking over the last few weeks of this course, that rejects aspects of the scientific revolution, that rejects aspects of the Enlightenment, and rejects the Industrial Revolution. That they look at this approach to society that says we can use a totally scientific approach to understand and better and even control human beings, nature, politics, and society. And they say this creates, if we have this mechanistic approach, this leads to the violence of the French Revolution and the oppression of the Industrial Revolution. And they say we should reject all of this. And instead, we need to have a society that's much more focused on the individual. And so Romanticism gets its name from a romanticization of society before industrialization, and a romanticization of the individual's emotions, the individual's genius. These are the things that the Romantics emphasize. And so it's from the Romantics that we have this idea of the sunset as something that's contemplated and something that's beautiful. Not that people didn't think that sunsets were beautiful before, but that they were kind of more integrated into our experience of nature before. But now with Romantics, they want to emphasize what it is about nature that's kind of mystical. It's a sort of mystical approach to nature. We also see this in an approach to history. So today, one example would be Irish dancing, the romanticization of a sort of Celtic past. This is one of the reactions to the Industrial Revolution, one of the rejections of the Industrial Revolution, that Romantics see the Industrial Revolution as crushing the genius and the freedoms of individuals and want to pull back from that. And we see that in the literature, something like Frankenstein that says trying to create the ideal person or the ideal being, that's very dangerous, that gets you into trouble. We see it in romantic music, like Chopin's Nocturnes, romanticizing the night. And we also see it in art as well, as you'll see in the PowerPoint. And so the question that I'll leave you with as we conclude this week on the Industrial Revolution is the Industrial Revolution worth it? Is the sort of lifestyle that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, are the difficulties that I've outlined with the industrial family, are these difficulties that a growing population in the 18th and 19th centuries would have had to deal with anyway? Or are they unnatural products that go along with the Industrial Revolution that maybe it's not worth this type of stress to the lives of individuals and to the lives of households in order to have cheaper goods? And so I leave that question up to you. I hope you enjoy the week's work. Hope you're enjoying your semesters, and I'll see you soon.